I make a lot of Danganronpa remixes, and a lot of music for Danganronpa projects inspired by Danganronpa music, but I'm not the only one. Hi, I'm Corey, or Everything Fantasy, and in this video we're going to be talking about how to make Danganronpa music. What are the tools, tips, techniques and tricks you need to make either Danganronpa inspired music for a fan project for instance, or a Danganronpa remix. And in order to do that, it's important not to just focus on what I create, and instead focus on what a lot of creators create in terms of Danganronpa inspired music, remixes, cover songs, and so much more. Back in December last year, a bunch of us came together and released the Danganronpa fan album, a collection of remixes from Danganronpa, inspired by one of our favourite composers, Masafumi Takada. And what this all shows is that we all have our own unique twist on things as Danganronpa inspired composers. We aren't trying to copy Masafumi Takada, instead we're trying to recreate his music in our own original style, whilst also trying to stay true to the source material, and create content which could be in a Danganronpa game. And so this video is all about whether it's an original piece of music or a remix, how do you actually go about creating one? So in order to do this, we're going to cover four main things. Firstly, the tools that are useful in creating Danganronpa style music. And I'm more talking about virtual instruments, sample libraries, that sort of thing, rather than how to use a DAW. So we're not going to go too basic with it, but I'm open to doing that if it's useful. Secondly, we're going to talk about, from a music production standpoint, what production techniques are useful in replicating the style, and also a little bit about how we achieve them. Thirdly, a little bit about music theory itself, and how certain Danganronpa tracks tend to use very similar music theory techniques, and what exactly they are. It's why, for instance, someone like Hayden Graves can create an incredible sounding non-stop debate theme for Eden's Garden that sounds amazing in its own right, but also sounds like it could be from a Danganronpa game very easily. And finally, all about that special spice, the sort of originality aspect, and how we add our own element of inspirations and musical taste into our remixes. So a useful starting point is to talk about the tools that are needed to create a Danganronpa piece of music, whether it's something inspired by Danganronpa or a direct remake. Now, it's important to know, and I strongly believe this, you don't have to be using exactly the same tools that Masafumi Takada used in order to create music inspired by Danganronpa. Instead, it's all about capturing the essence and the spirit of the piece of music, whether it's by recreating your own synths, recreating your own electronic drum pads and things like that. Having said that, Megastrike has done an incredible job of creating a video highlighting many of the instruments that Takada himself has used. One of the really interesting things about the Danganronpa fan album, and this is not just a big advert for the album, although you should definitely give it a listen, is that every individual composer brought their own uniqueness to the tracks that they were trying to recreate. Here's Megastrike, for example, explaining some of the tools that they used in order to recreate the tracks of Masafumi Takada.
Hello Danganronpa enjoyers, it is I, Megastrike, and let's just get to the point. My first remix is Beautiful Dead. The original Beautiful Dead is really chill yet unnerving, so I decided to make a vaporwave remix, even though I made a lo-fi remix of it like a year ago. Anyway, try to listen to this track while scrolling through the liminal space images. I guarantee that you would feel like you're dreaming even though you're awake. Here are all the instruments and samples I used to make this remix.
So to put it really simply, these are a bunch of virtual instruments and sounds and sample libraries that Megastrike used to recreate Beautiful Dead, very similar to how Masafumi Takada would have done it. And in order to access these instruments, we use something called a DAW, Digital Audio Workstation, such as Logic Pro, FL Studio, Cubase, and many more. And while it is tempting to think that in order to recreate Danganronpa music, for instance, you have to be using exactly the same tools as Takada, that really isn't the case. In many ways, so many of the sounds and ideas can be recreated regardless of what DAW or what sample library you're actually using.
And my third remix for this album is Distrust. This is an ambitious track, And I gotta say I put a lot of effort into this, especially the orchestra part. The electronic part is pretty straightforward though, but with a lot of glitchy and complex samples. Oh, and I also added a vocal somewhere. Try to find it. And as always, here are all the stuff I use.
But it's always worth thinking about more traditional synthesizers, for instance, which are incredibly useful in recreating the style of Danganronpa. For starters, Masafumi Takada himself used many different types of synthesizers. In Mika and Salex's arrangement of Let's Kill Each Other, for example, they used a JV1080 and various different Roland string libraries in order to recreate a very similar sound, but in their own unique way. Or similarly, for NO3 in Mika's arrangement of Genocide is Fever from Ultra Despair Girls, which utilized a Roland sound canvas. But what do you do in a situation where you can't find exactly the same samples or tools and you can't really get it close to the original sound that Takada created? Well, an alternative is to use a different sound altogether, and Adachi gives a really good example of that.
So, after Melody had a somewhat troubled development, I remember very well me, Mika and NEF searching for the vocals in a lot of sample libraries, but in the end I decided to do something simpler. Instead of the vocals, we used the saxophone Everything Fantasy performed, and he did it pretty well. I really liked the final result, and I also liked the finger snaps I used. They gave a more jazzy vibe to the track, and I like it.
Separately, Mika has created an equipment board of many of the known software, instrument, sample libraries, etc. that Masafumi Takada uses. Now, when I talk about music production techniques, I'm referring to things you can do in a digital audio workstation or DAW that really elevates your music to the next level, and Danganronpa does a lot of different music production techniques. Now, some of the obvious ones are things like reverb and delays and compression and things like that, all concepts which I'm very happy to go into more detail about. But there are definitely a few things which are exclusive to Masafumi Takada's style in some ways, such as the use of sidechain compression to really add that pumping feeling to tracks like Heat Up and Hope vs. Despair, for instance. There are more classic techniques such as reversing audio samples and things like that. But a really interesting one is the idea of triggering samples within a DAW or using a sampler to trigger samples at different times. And what I mean, and what I'm referring to is, for example, how Takada uses the 8 hours sample in Heat Up.
When I started to read Hits Up, it was supposed to be a rock track. You guys know rock with guitars, organ, bass, rock drums, and all that stuff. But I realized, dude, this is sounding too strange. I'll do an electronic version. And I used the guitar Zigge recorded for me, and this version is pretty cool actually. Make Strike also helped with the vocal sample chops. Thanks guys. And I don't think this track will be the same without it, so thanks and bye.
So the question from here is, how does this relate to making Danganronpa music as a whole? Well, the interesting thing is that there's a pattern. Certain types of Danganronpa tracks tend to utilize very particular techniques. For example, you want an exploration theme, like Beautiful Lie? Well, laid-back synth pads with long attack and release times, elongated reverbs and things like that are incredibly useful. It's what we hear in Beautiful Lie, Beautiful Dead, Beautiful Ruin, for instance. Alternatively, want a fast-paced, intense class trial theme? Sidechain compression, triggering samples and things like that are going to be incredibly valuable. Or an investigation theme, Box 15, Ikarushia, Despair Searching. In which case, the trumpet, for example, isn't just a trumpet that makes a really nice and intricate sound. It's a trumpet with a very, very noticeable echo, a ping-pong echo which kind of moves back and forth a little bit from left to right, and a subtle reverb as well. It's these small things which really help to differentiate the sound of Danganronpa from a lot of other video games. Now, Danganronpa is very context heavy. It's very much reliant on the setting of being in a killing game and trying to heighten the emotions of a killing game, whether it's an intense investigation theme, the hyper energy, high energy class trial themes, or a much more relaxing and laid back, beautiful theme, for instance, while you're exploring the school for the first time. But crucially, you couldn't take a Danganronpa piece of music, for example, and put it in, say, Zero Escape or Ace Attorney. It just outright wouldn't work. And so it poses the question of, What is the uniqueness of a Danganronpa piece of music? How does Masafumi Takada actually go about creating music which sounds so suited to a particular universe of games? Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail because I've literally done videos on all of these things, but let's just cover the basics. The majority of Danganronpa tracks are in the time signature 4/4, except interestingly for exploration themes which tend to vary from time to time. The most common key signature is G minor, followed closely by C minor. Anywhere between 120 and 130 BPM is a reasonable tempo for the majority of Danganronpa pieces. All investigation themes are structured in almost an identical way, containing a key change at the end of it, and a huge amount of Danganronpa pieces revolve around a single chord. An interesting thing to try out as a limitation if you're trying to recreate the style. Now, so far we've spoken a lot about recreating existing Danganronpa pieces of music, but there's so much more to the idea of recreation than just copying what already exists. There's something to do with adding your own spice to it. When I try and create a Danganronpa remix, for example, I try and make sure that it's my Danganronpa remix rather than something which anyone could have made. And that largely involves adding your own uniqueness, the element of your influences and your own style and personal tastes that helps to differentiate what you do from anything that already exists.
My second remix is Despair Searching. Now this remix has a lot of 70s influences, and I gotta say I was inspired by Bee Gees' Stayin' Alive. But instead of a happy and funky song, I want it to be dark yet funky, and obviously the original Despair Searching is dark, so yeah, that's appropriate. Anyway, here are all the stuff I use, and big thanks to Mikan Sumikiwi for providing the Persona sound font.
It's a matter of experimentation ultimately. Your original idea might be one thing, but what it turns into might be something completely different.
Since I started to read Korosha, I went to the medley. And first of all, I tried a medley with Box 15, but there are a lot of medleys like this in YouTube. So I tried a medley with Nagito's team, and I really like the result. This album doesn't have any other Danganronpa 2 tracks, so you guys can call this Goodbye Despair medley or something like this. And that's all, I hope you guys like it.
Why recreate one Danganronpa piece of music when you can combine two together like Adachi did? Or separately completely changing the style of Beautiful Lie? Or turning Beautiful Dead into a Vaporwave remix? There are so many possibilities in many ways.
Hey, I'm Totodex and I'm the musician that did the Climax Reenactment remix in the album. For my song, it wasn't really inspired or motivated by much, instead more being based off of my own work and my own style rather than any pre-existing thing. As can be seen with the song, it's very different from the original as my own style doesn't have any sort of EDM elements instead of being orchestral. It's actually very reminiscent of the work I have done in the Game Stars Align.
But in many ways you can take this even further, adding lyrics to Danganronpa songs which never originally had lyrics, for instance, or even just singing over the top in your own style adds so much uniqueness to your recreation. Hilly is a good example of that.
Hi, I'm Hilaria, and I'm here to tell you about a review that I'm making of the track we made with Everything Fantasy. That was Kamito, I would say. I'd say my main inspirations for this song would be the main song, the first one that was made by Binaria. Also, all the works that were provided by Everything Fantasy so far. So the orchestral thing is the main progress. I wanted to go for that.
So what this really shows is that there isn't one way of recreating Danganronpa music, or even creating original music inspired by Danganronpa. It's essentially a combination of two things. Using the principles which Masafumi Takada has instilled in so much of his music, not only in Danganronpa but in other games too, and also that uniqueness, that original flair. Someone who's trying to change the way music is created using their own influences. So there it is. 1 year after the last analysis video, I've finally done another one. But I'm hoping to do this way more often, turn it into a bit more of a norm of the channel. So if you have any ideas, whether it's a completely different game or a topic or anything, definitely let me know in the comments down below. I'm hoping to do different genres, more games, different concepts, maybe music theory videos, production videos, so much more. But until next time, thanks for watching and take care.